I wish you, first of all, a warm welcome to our Arab Sembas migration cycle. In our last session, we had discussed the political economy of migration in the Arab world, focusing mainly on rentierism and the migration diplomacy of Arab states. And today's session will mainly focus on migration's contribution to host countries. The journey of migrants or refugees and as entrepreneurs will be highlighted, as well as the ability of migrants and refugees to negotiate diverse economic opportunities through their community networks. Yet by looking only at host countries, we oftentimes forget that migration also has a positive impact on sending countries, which can either be economic, but also social and political. And in order to discuss these different topics today, we have invited four specialists. Paul Tabar from the Western Sydney University, Australia. Thank you for being with us, Paul. Dounia Smaali from the University of Tunis, Manar. Thank you, Dounia, for joining us. Oroub El-Abed from the University of Birzeit, Palestine. Thanks for being with us, Oroub. And we also have with us Maya Chehade from Sciences Po Paris in France, and she's now based in Cairo. So thank you for joining us, Maya, as well. Paul, as I said, you are with us today directly from Australia, where it is already midnight. So I would love to open the floor with you, maybe allowing you to speak first. Before you do this, allow me to introduce you very briefly to our audience. So Dr. Paul Tabar is an adjunct professor and a senior researcher at the Institute for Culture and Society at the Western Sydney University in Australia. He taught at the Lebanese American University in Beyrouth from 2004 to 2020, during which time he was also the director of the Institute for Migration Studies at LAU and the chairperson of the Department of Social Sciences. He holds a PhD in sociology and anthropology from Macquarie University, Sydney, Australia. And his research interests include migration, diasporic relations, multiculturalism, racism, and Lebanese state and society relations. And for us today, he will intervene on the topic on social and political remittances of migration. So basically, the positive impact that sending countries can also get out from migration. So Paul, I'll leave the floor to you for 20 to 30 minutes.
No problem. Thank you for the invite. Thank you for your kind introduction. I'm very glad to meet young and very enthusiastic scholars. That gives me a sense of hope that migration studies in the Arab world is really in good shape. Especially, as a matter of fact, on that note, when I first returned from Australia, because I migrated to Australia in 1971 when I was still very young. And when I first attempted to go back to Lebanon and leave teaching in Australia in order to teach in Lebanon, I really was stunned and surprised to find out that, academically speaking, from a university point of view, from a research point of view, there were very rare interest in migration as such. And not only in Lebanon, which is paradoxical. I mean, a country by definition known in its history since the 19th century to be a very much affected by migration, whether immigration or immigration. So, whether return migration or sending people out of Lebanon since the 19th century, early 19th century, I would say not mid-19th century. But also in the Arab world. And the only place that I found really interested and given some special interest in was actually, Beyrouth, Cairo University, American University of Cairo, American University of Beirut and American University of Cairo. Rahim Awad, I think, was a kind professor and I had a colleague, who is Lebanese Australian and was working at the time there, Ray Radini. And the focus was mainly on refugee studies as well there, which it's very interesting and undoubtedly. But, migration as a phenomenon, as a global phenomenon, was not really a focus unfortunately, in academia in the Arab world. So the first thing that I started to think about when I went to Lebanon was to sort of bring the idea of the need to study migration seriously and put an end, especially in Lebanon, to this ideological narrative about migration, which is, it's very silly, but it's very important because it really served the system. And I will talk in a moment about what I mean by this. But it served the system in the sense that it made people taking migration and emigration from Lebanon for granted, and it's as if it is in the nature of Lebanese people to be adventurous and to be migrants and to look out for leaving the country, and tying up this with the historical roots of being Phoenicians as well. The Phoenicians are the ones who first, sailed the sea, and so it's all completely ideological. So it's an interesting. One can write a really nice article to link this ideological narrative to the system and the ruling class, interest of the ruling class, undoubtedly. But this is something beside the point of our meeting tonight. Okay, so part of what I did is that I founded, modestly speaking, I founded an Institute for Migration Studies at LAU. But prior to that, before I went to LAU, I was waiting for LAU to move to LAU or AUB. In the meantime, I just worked from 2000 to 2004 at Notre Dame University. And also at Notre Dame University, I initiated the idea of, look, we should have a center for the study of migration, and hence the establishment of LERC, Lebanese Immigration Research Center, which later on was taken up by the institute, by the university, and I moved to LAU and established Institute for Migration Studies. Now, it's not a huge event, but rather, I think it put a foundation stone for something that could be later on developed into an interesting research center in Lebanon. I say this because I think, honestly, that the Arab world needs to deal more and more seriously, and from a scholarly point of view, from a research point of view, from a multidisciplinary and from specific disciplines with the idea of migration, whether internal, immigration out of the country, return migration, diasporic studies, and so on and so forth. Okay, hence my interest in the present talk. First, I was introduced to the idea of social remittances by the anthropologist whom I respect highly. Her name is Peggy Levitt. And I remember once the first time we met her, it was in Paris actually, and we had a conference there, and Peggy was around. And Peggy, coined the term social remittances. Now, historically, remittances were used as a concept to talk about financial remittances. And Peggy, came up with this idea that immigrants do not only remit financially, but also they remit social values, social norms, social conduct, social practices. And of course, at the time she was talking about, the venues and the channels through which they can send these remittances. And of course, when she wrote that, social media was not so popular and so developed. And if she has to now write more about the same topic, she would, I'm sure, have added a lot on the impact of social media on remitting social remittances on transferring social remittances to the sending country, and vice versa sometimes, undoubtedly. But be that as it may, the first thing I thought when I read her work on social remittances was to ask myself, why is it that Peggy Levitt combine political remittances with social remittances? And she talks about political values and political practices as part and parcel of social remittances. And I thought that there was a need for analytical distinction between the two, not only analytical, but also, in reality, because one can make a case for political remittances. Immigrants do transfer political remittances, and in many ways, shapes and forms. And we have witnessed this during the Arab Spring and the role of social media and immigrants in doing so. We are still witnessing this in the Arab world, and more specifically in Lebanon, which is the case study I'm using to support what I'm talking about. And as a result, I wrote a paper on the concept and the need to distinguish between social and political remittances. Now, simply because people involved politically, if they are migrants, in political activities, and these political activities, by the way, are oriented towards homeland. And therefore, they are, if you wish, diasporic political activities. Now, I also made a distinction, and I wrote a paper, I don't know if you have seen it, to distinguish between transnational relations and diasporic relations. Diasporic relations are transnational relations, but not all transnational relations are diasporic relations. Because diasporic relations, although they are cross-national relations, the orientation, the ultimate aim is the homeland. Whether you're going to return there or you don't return, but your activity is focusing on homeland. And therefore, the need to distinguish again between diasporic and transnational relations. So, in a way, when I started to think about the need to distinguish between political and economic and social remittances, then came the question of how can we measure these remittances? And obviously, there are measurable political remittances and unmeasurable political remittances. The measurable ones can be illustrated by donations, money. Money can be quantitative, can be quantified. And I was a very active leftist person in the 70s and the 80s, supporting the Lebanese national movement during the civil war and a few years prior to the civil war. And we formed a group in Australia, and that group used to raise funding and send the funding to the political group that I affiliated with. So many others did the same, the right-wingers and the left-wingers and the nationalists and whatever groups there were at the time. And they were very active in Australia. I mean, we formed a similar, if you wish, you can talk about the same political forces being represented in Australia, reflecting the same political mapping and landscape in Lebanon. You had the Phalangists, you had the Lebanese forces, you had the Communist Party, you had the Organization of Communist Action, you had all the groups being represented here and highly engaged in many activities, one of which was obviously, raising money, something that I call measurable political remittances. The other thing that can be measurable, things like, sometimes you have an election, for instance, and people volunteer to go and play a role to assist their mother parties in Lebanon during the election, or they mobilize people in the diaspora and pay them tickets, which happened in the last 2 or 3 elections in Lebanon, to pay them ticket to go to Lebanon and cast their votes over there. So volunteering can be quantified, how many people, the resources, the money are being mobilized from the diaspora to do this. Another, of course, very quantifiable kind of political remittance is casting your votes, participating in the election, which has been given by law to Lebanon, to Lebanese abroad. And during the last 2 elections, 2018 and 2022, the diaspora across the world participated in the election by casting votes from abroad, let alone the ones who went to Lebanon in person in order to do so. And if you examine the percentages of those who participated in 2018, percentage of those who participated to the percentage of those who participated in the last election of 2022, you find a big increase, like by, I don't know, remember, but no less than by 20% or 30% increase in the number of those who participated in the voting process. Not only this, a recent study by a social scientist in Lebanon, a researcher working at the Lebanese, what is called Lebanese Center for Studies or something. I don't remember the, yeah. Did publish, sorry?
Lebanese Center for Social Studies.
Yes. It's located in the building close to LAU, actually, in Hamra. And they showed that 7 seats in the last election were determined, were winnable because of the votes of the diaspora, 7 seats. And 5 of them were in favor of the candidates who supported 17 October uprising. So that's very important to keep in mind. I'm sure there are similar cases in Tunisia, and I'm sure the scholar from Tunisia can probably point out to this. And there are cases of participation in probably Algeria and the Maghreb, especially those participants who come from France and from Europe in general during elections. But be that as it may, I just wanted to say this to tell you about the measurable aspect of political remittances, which we have to keep in mind, of course. But there is also a non-measurable aspect. The non-measurable is something that can be an idea, can be a practice, can be, also all what we call sometimes in research methodology qualitative characteristics rather than quantitative characteristics. And believe me, this is something that is happening on a daily basis, especially with the fact of social media and the development of the various channels in social media, and the use of social media, heavy, intensive use of social media by immigrants and the receivers back at home. Ideas are being constantly, political ideas, therefore non-measurable in terms of quantity, being sent constantly and discussed over these platforms constantly. And you just have to go to Facebook and find out how many groups there are, or Instagram or WhatsApp groups. I'm already with 3-4 groups. The last contact I received, actually, it was from Canada. asking me that they have a group of 70 people who are interested in the perpetuation of the ideals of the 17th October uprising, and they want to continue with that movement from the diaspora. And they have branches in Europe, and now they are looking for a branch in Australia. And that's the latest I've received, actually, the call yesterday to join them, and so on and so forth. So social media is being very important in this context, and in the context of like remitting and discussing what I call non-measurable political remittances. The other thing that is important to keep in mind is the fact when we talk about the impact of political remittances, there is the kind of immediate impact, and I gave an example of the election, casting votes, quantifiable, immediate impact, and other things like donating money, raising funding, and so on and so forth. But also there is a long-term impact, and which has to do more with, if you want, not only quantitative quantifiable political remittances, but also non-measurable political remittances. You have to examine them in the long run. The impact of this interaction of ideas between the diaspora and the receiving country political groups. In the long run, what kind of impact? So that would require definitely longitudinal study and research, like over 10 years or 20 years, like follow up on a particular sample in order to find out what impact the diaspora is having on homeland in this sense. So up to this point, I think the points are clear. Do you have any question on that idea? Or would you like to leave the questions till the end?
No, I would love to maybe open the floor to some questions if the audience has some. I do have some for you, if you don't mind.
Yes.
You mentioned in your presentation the Arab Spring a couple of times, and I was wondering how concretely this remittances played out in the case of the Thawra on October in Lebanon. What kind of political values were pushed, and maybe also what kind of social remittances did you see? What kind of ideas did circulate? And another question I would have for you is also with regard to the independence of the Lebanese diaspora that is abroad, that is trying to influence homeland politics, if I can put it that way. To what extent can they remain completely independent, or is there also a risk of getting sometimes instrumentalized by the homeland? This is something I would also. My third question would be, how lasting are those initiatives, and how lasting are actually those political remittances that are being transmitted by the Lebanese diaspora backwards to their homeland?
Okay, you asked me, the first one is about political remittances as non-measurable, is it?
Yeah.
The ideas, and yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay. Look, during the 17 October uprising, definitely there was a lot of support in the diaspora to what was raised as demands and claims that revolved around the reforming of the system, the ending of the confessional system, and so on and so forth. Now, I don't claim that they have initiated new ideas, or they have initiated, if you wish, the uprising itself. The idea of course, the uprising was the product of Lebanese dynamics, political dynamics. But definitely the echo and the impact of what was happening in Lebanon was present and highly present in the diaspora. Now, having said this, I would say there were initiatives done by the diaspora which were more about new tactics or new pressure that were not thought necessarily or instigated by Homeland, but rather by the diaspora itself. There were initiatives, for instance, to lobby governments in the receiving country. There were initiatives like in France, I remember, in order to file a case in the court against the banks. I think the same happened in England as well. So these initiatives, there are a number of initiatives, I would say. There were initiatives, for instance, that we should organize a trip to local MPs in Australia in order to ask them to raise the demands of the Lebanese in the diaspora regarding the reforming of the system through their own channels, governmental channels. So these initiatives within the context of what was happening in the diaspora, I think they were only done by the diaspora, not necessarily guided or instructed by Lebanese counterparts, if you know what I mean. The second part that you were asking about, was it how lasting it is, or there was something before? Sorry.
Yeah, you can also maybe answer this first. How lasting are those initiatives also on the ground?
These initiatives. Yeah. In fact, the same thing you can ask about the fate of the uprising in Lebanon. How lasting is it, the uprising, and who remained actually active and still active in that context. The same thing happens, in the diaspora, I think, in that sense. However, again, there are certain initiatives in the diaspora that are not necessarily understood as a mirror image of what is happening in Lebanon. There are groups being formed and constantly in discussion about the question of how can we keep up the momentum in the diaspora in support of reform in Lebanon, reform that were initiated by the October uprising. The last of which, as I told you, is the one that I have received from Canada. At the moment, I don't have the name of the group, but I do have it somewhere. I can send it to those who are interested if you send me an email later. In Australia, for instance, I keep receiving emails and invitation for meetings with USOS. USOS is a group who was formed during the uprising and mainly is very active in the Gulf by the Lebanese who belong to the northern of Lebanon, the northern district of Lebanon. And they are constantly working on meeting via social media to raise the question as what is happening to the uprising and how can we keep up the momentum and prepare ourselves for the next election. USOS, OSOS. It means in Arabic foundations. And that's why it's called USOS. It is actually more to do with Zgharta, if you know the northern of Lebanon, Bsharri, Zgharta, Kura district, the third or the second district in the north. Yes, there are many initiatives. Like I'm sure in France and in Europe, there are also groups who are working on the same issue. Yeah, in that sense, I believe the diaspora could be um, um, working on the claims raised by the uprising at a time when those who started the whole thing in Lebanon are dormant in a way, at the moment. So it is not at all, as I said, mechanically reflecting what is happening in Lebanon. Now, when you say how lasting it will be, it's a difficult question. It depends, on the dynamics, and it depends on political events in Lebanon and in the diaspora, and the interaction between the two. It depends on, I don't know, on many variables. I mean, what is happening now in Lebanon, for instance, regarding the Arab-Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and on the northern of Lebanon, and probably a war can erupt, and which might put the uprising demands on the back burner rather than on the front burner, and which is already doing it, and so there are many variables. But normally when we talk about, sorry, that's the last point. Normally when we talk about diaspora, one thing has to be kept in mind. One, not all immigrants are engaged in in diasporic activities. Okay, and the ones who are engaged can be, if you want, distinguished between two groups, can be differentiated between two groups, can be divided into two groups. A dormant diaspora, that it is, waiting for when things are inflamed, when they are like, there is a conflict, or there is a very controversial issue, there is an invasion, there is a war, there is an uprising, there is a demonstration, then they wake up and they take part. And there is the active diaspora, the active group. So I would say within that context, one has to probably think about and analyze, how how much the diaspora can sustain its activity as far as 17 October uprising is concerned.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'd ask myself just a last question to you, and then I move on to Dounia. I was just wondering, this is where I was asking also how lasting this is, because it obviously depends also on the openness of the host country. To what extent does a host country let the diasporas express themselves and mobilize for their...
I will address this in the second part because I stopped my talk.
All right.
I will address this for sure.
Okay, so very, very briefly then.
Yeah. Okay, can I continue now? Okay. Now, look, I use Bourdieu in order to apply some of his concepts on the study of diaspora. Why is it that I use Bourdieu, or I think with his concepts about diaspora? Because I find it, analytically very useful. In my opinion, one can talk about a diasporic political field in the Bourdieusian sense. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Bourdieu, but I can do my best to clarify the concept as I go on. So a field is a set of power relations, and power relations are formed around the capital and the possession, if you wish, of the capital specific to that field. And since we are talking about diasporic political field, the capital would be, diasporic political capital. So the more you, if you wish, have of that capital, ultimately, it is represented by the political system back home, accepted by the political system back home, the more your remittances from within that field, from outside as a member of the diaspora, will be accepted in Lebanon. And the more you are contesting the political capital in Lebanon as a member of the diaspora engaged in the diasporic political field, the less you will be recognized and the more resistance you will face in dealing and trying to remitting new ideas and reform ideas back home. So that's why I find field is important, because Bourdieu talks about capital and he talks about legitimate capital when it is in line with the logic of the state, when it is in line with what the state recognizes as legitimate. But also Bourdieu, and that's why I find the concept interesting, talks about the field as a site of contest. In other words, people don't only fight over who possesses more of the legitimate capital. And in this instance, it is the diasporic political capital. But he also talks about the struggle goes on around the definition of what constitutes a legitimate political capital, diasporic political capital. Hence, if you have people who are supportive in the diaspora of the uprising and raising demands and remitting demands, political demands or political claims, making political claims, which are focusing on the need to reform the system, then they will be, in fact, engaging in redefining the legitimacy of the political capital by challenging the dominant one and wanting to replace the dominant one with a new one. And in the case of Lebanon, with a non-confessional political capital, with a political capital which makes corrupt politicians accountable, which separate the power, judiciary power from legislative power, and so on. So all these demands that were raised during the uprising. So in that sense, I think the concept of field and diasporic political capital, even though Bourdieu, by the way, used this concept in the context of a national state and did not use it in the context of and migration studies, one can easily, and there is no problem at all in transporting this concept to the study of diaspora and diasporic relations. So in that sense, I find it very interesting. And here one can talk about what is remitted and how the political remittances are being received in the sending country. Are they being resisted? Are they being accepted? What is the regime of recognition, i.e. the dominant ideology that is setting the rule for what should be accepted and what should not be accepted? And the struggle, as I said, also when there is an upheaval or an uprising, would also be focusing on redefining the basis, the criteria of legitimacy in the political system. Okay, so instead of considering the only thing that the sending country would accept as a form of political remittances would be the political remittances that would justify confessional system in Lebanon. In the case of a political remittances which is challenging confessionalism, we would be here facing a different reception by the sending country to it. And in fact, as a result of the last election, the voice of the uprising were represented by at least 13 new member of parliament, which is a kind of a dent in the dominant structure of the state. It's not a complete reform, of course. It's not a reform. It's not a change that would lead to reform, but it is a beginning, if you wish, some sort of a beginning for the reform process to take place. Anyhow, reforming political system don't have to be necessarily a revolutionary act. You know, one act, and then you change the system. It might be a long process. So in that sense, I invite people to think with Bourdieu when they talk about diasporic relations, because it really captures the struggle. It really captures regime of recognition in the sending country, but it also allows us to talk about how the diasporic political field is formed not only as a result of an interest in the sending country, but also as a result of being present in the receiving country. So under what conditions one can raise the same question here to talk about how this field is formed, i.e. diasporic political field, how it is formed under the conditions of a French political system for the diaspora in France. Or, more interestingly, how is it formed under the condition of multiculturalism in Australia? Because multiculturalism in Australia is an official policy to deal and handle migrant communities. So, you know, the respect of, which is completely different to the tradition in France, where citizenship is, you know, the main political criteria for integration. In Australia, you are integrated as being different. You know, multiculturalism is part and parcel. That's at least the policy. You know, is part and parcel of how you define the Australian identity, political identity. So here again, you know, I mean, in for instance, if you go to the Gulf, right, the Gulf wouldn't allow you to get organized into political groups for reasons, obvious reasons, you know, and not only this, you are not even secured if you try to do so in terms of staying in the country. You can easily be, you know, kicked out. In Australia, that is something impossible, you know, near impossible. So that's something to take into account. So the formation of the field has to be thought of in relation to receiving country and to sending country. And that's it. Just I think would like to conclude by stating that I have to advocate and ask you to think about, if you wish, reflect with me on the utility, analytical utility of the concept of political remittances as being distinct from social remittances, and invite you to think about and reflect upon the idea of a diasporic political field and the controversial or conflictual nature of that field, and under what conditions this field is formed and shaped in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, for your insights. I'm sure we probably will come back to some of the points you raised in your discussion. Although the other three interventions that we have planned for today are much more focusing on the receiving countries and on host countries, and to see how migrants actually contribute there to the diversification of the host state's economy. So I would have loved to give the floor to Dounia Smaali right now. Dounia is joining again. I see that her internet connection is a little bit unstable, but Dounia, can you hear me? Can you hear
Yes, yes, I'm sorry, I can hear you because I'm sorry, my connection is very unstable. So
we'll give it a try. Maybe you can switch off your video so that
camera.
we can hear you. Yeah, your camera.
Okay, so I'll start.
You have
start
PowerPoint.
or
I will give you.
yes.
the possibility to share. Here you go.
Okay, thank you.
So while Dounia is loading her PowerPoint, I will briefly introduce her as well to the audience. So Dr. Dounia Smaali Bouhlila serves as an associate professor at the Faculty of Economics and Management at the University of Tunis Manar. Her extensive academic background includes a PhD in development economics. She has garnered recognition for her scholarly work with publications featured in reputable international academic journals. Additionally, her expertise has been sought after by several international institutions, such as the World Bank and the International Institute of Islamic Thought in Washington, D.C., where she has served as a short-term consultant, and currently Dounia holds the role of associate editor at the International Journal of Educational Development. And she also teaches on migration policy. So this is why we have asked her to sketch a little bit the overview of today's panel on economic diversification in host countries. So Dounia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you for inviting me to this roundtable. Do you hear me first of all?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so I'll start my presentation. So my presentation is about whether migration is a catalyst for economic diversification in the host country. I will move the slide. Okay, nothing works. I'm sorry. Oops. Sorry.
If it doesn't work, if it doesn't work with the slide, let's do without it. If it's fine for you. Oh, she disappeared. She's back again. Dounia, can you hear us?
Yeah. Do you see my screen?
No. No, but I suggested if it's not necessary, maybe we can do it without if the connection is not good enough.
Okay. So
yeah.
So I prepared a presentation where the outline is composed of four points. This one is to set the context of the inquiry and framing the central question for debate. And the second one is to tackle the theoretical framework guiding the this analysis. And then we will examine whether migration acts as a burden or a threat for the economy. And finally, I will conclude with investigating the role of social and solidarity economics with a focus on its implications for migrant integration and economic development. We all know that migration has been a fundamental aspect for human history, economies and cultures for centuries. And in particular, the movement of people from south to north regions has played a pivotal role in the development of strong economies in the past. And historically, this migration pattern often involved low skilled or unskilled individuals seeking better opportunities more economically and in advanced countries. And the labor and contributions played a crucial role in building and sustaining the prosperity of the host nations. However, in recent years, there has been a notable shift in migration patterns, particularly in terms of skills levels and destination regions. Rather than predominantly low-skilled workers, there's now a growing demand for skilled individuals in many destination countries. And this shift, in fact, reflects evolving economic needs and increasing importance of specialized knowledge and expertise in today's globalized economy. So it's increasingly evident that migration patterns are not solely defined by movement from south to north regions. Migration, if you can say that, encompasses significant migration flows within the global south. Conversely, migration within regions such as from south to south country often involves a higher proportion of low-skilled or unskilled migrants, and this is particularly evident in countries like Tunisia and Jordan, which already face economic fragility and challenges. So the influx of migrants seeking better prospects in these contexts raises, in fact, questions about the potential impact on local economies and societies. So I think
Dounia,
okay.
we can't see the PowerPoint, so it doesn't move forward. Now it's better.
Ah, you cannot. Okay. So I tried, but okay. So it's a failure. So the question. So I will continue without the PowerPoint presentation. So the main question we are going to debate is that will we witness, in fact, a similar transformation as seen in Europe, where migration of low-skilled individuals contributed to economic growth and development, or will the influx of low-skilled migrants in economically fragile countries like Tunisia and Jordan mainly lead to detrimental effects, potentially undermining their already precarious economic situations? So in this presentation, I will contemplate whether migrants in Arab countries, and as I said, Jordan and Tunisia, represent a burden or a catalyst for the economy. To provide first the context for this discussion, we'll begin by discussing the network theory, which offers insights into the mechanisms driving migration patterns and the formation of migrant communities. So by examining the role of social networks in shaping migration flows, so we can better understand the dynamics underlying the influx of migrants into a given region. Following this, I will then delve into the broader debate surrounding the economic impact of migration, considering factors such as labor market dynamics, fiscal implications, and long-term economic development. So through this general analysis, we will provide elements to help us assess whether migration tends to impose economic burdens or stimulate economic growth within the host country. So if we start with the theoretical framework, and very briefly here, so labor migration may begin for a variety of reasons, and we all know that people migrate just to enhance, to look for better opportunities, and there are many other forces that push people to migrate or to move from one place to another. And so these forces, in fact, they shape the migration patterns. In fact, once a certain critical number of migrants have settled at a certain country or the destination country, other forces come into play. And the pioneer migrants tend to have a great influence on subsequent migration patterns. And in fact, migration facilitates the flow of information back from the place of destination to the origin, which facilitates the passage for later migrants. Moreover, there is evidence that the already settled migrants function as bridgeheads, and these migrants who serve as bridgeheads, they generally reduce risks as well as material risks, psychological costs, and subsequent migration. The migrants who already settled in the host country, they provide assistance to the new migrants, and these new migrants they may be able to obtain information, receive active assistance in finding employment and a place to live, and even in arranging residence papers or in finding a marriage partner. Therefore, the formation of an established migrant community at one particular destination will increase the likelihood of subsequent migration to that particular place. In more recent studies, the term network migration, or what we call the theory of network migration, has been usually used to describe this process. And we also talk about chain migration. So network is all the interpersonal ties that connect migrants, former migrants, and non-migrants in origin and destination areas through bonds of kinship, friendship, and shared community of origin. Now let's try to provide some elements to the question, which is whether migration acts as a burden or a catalyst to the economy. And we all know that in Tunisia, in both Tunisia and Jordan, the diverse array of migrant categories, comprising refugees, asylum seekers, particularly from Syria and Jordan, and sub-Saharan migrants in Tunisia who arrive via legal or illegal channels. And the objectives of these migrant groups, they vary, although the overarching goals include pursuing enhanced opportunities and looking for a decent livelihood and forging a new path in the host country. For certain migrants, and especially for those who come to Tunisia, or Tunisia is the case, and the country serves solely as a transit, with the ultimate objective of reaching Europe through irregular migration channels from, of course, the Tunisian coastline. So analyzing whether migration acts as a burden or a catalyst for the host nation's economy requires scrutinizing migrants' goals. So this is a microeconomic approach, and time horizon. It means that we need to distinguish between the short run and long run perspectives. Additionally, assessing migrants' effects on three key domains, which are the labor market, the public finances, and economic growth. This is essential. And the presentation, in fact, will focus on these specific areas. So the approach, or our approach, is macro rather than micro. In economic terms, the word burden refers to a situation where certain factors or entities place a strain or impose costs on the economy of a country. In our specific context, this can manifest in various ways. First, there are what you call the financial costs incurred by migration. These financial costs may be perceived as a burden when, if, for instance, they place significant demands on public services like education, healthcare, social welfare programs, etc. and they place a burden on the resources because they do not, they without contributing proportionately to the tax base. Second, migration can be a burden or can incur a cost. When you talk about the social integration costs, for instance, the programs and all the initiatives aimed at helping migrants adapt to their new environment, this will result in significant financial resources. So if ever we fail to effectively integrate the migrants into the society, this may lead to social tensions, and these social tensions may have economic consequences in terms of reduced productivity, investment. The third type of cost is the security and legal costs. And you know that governments may incur expenses related to maintaining the security and enforcing immigration laws, particularly in cases where migrants enter the country illegally or pose security risks. So these the cumulative impact of these costs can significantly strain the public finances of a country, particularly in the short run, especially when resources are limited and especially when the informal sector is substantial in size. And this, in fact, prompts us to consider the ramifications for the labor market as well. Because migrants, and I'm talking about Jordan and Tunisia, migrants are who come to these countries are usually low-skilled or medium-skilled, and they're usually employed in low-skilled or informal sectors with lower productivity. And we all know that this will have an impact on economic growth and the overall efficiency. So while the informal sector plays a significant role in many economies, including Tunisia, providing employment opportunities and contributing to economic activity, it also presents several economic disadvantages, not only for the locals, but also for the migrants. For the informal sector, we know that there's a lack of regulation and taxation because activities in the informal sector, they operate outside the formal regulations. So people who work in the informal sector, they often evade taxation. And these resources the government needs these resources in order to develop the certain public services infrastructure. People working in the informal sector, they have low productivity. Why? Because they have low skills. They typically lack access to modern technologies, and they lack skills in training, in capital investment, etc. Compared, of course, to those who are in the formal sector. Again, those who work in the informal sector, they have limited access to finance, the loans, the credits, facilities, and this is, of course, an obstacle, but because it limits their ability to expand operations or invest in productivity-enhancing technologies. People working or migrants, locals or migrants working in the informal sector, they lack social security and benefits. They're also vulnerable, and they also may vulnerable because when they are mainly hired in agricultural, construction, and domestic work, and they often face exploitation, including low wages, unsafe working conditions, and lack for job security. And they also they may also be more susceptible to economic shocks, such as fluctuations in commodity prices or demand for their services. And we also know that the informal sector can undermine the formal economic activities because it creates some sort of unfair competition for formal businesses which comply with regulation. And those migrants who work in the informal sector, they can be trapped in informality, and they can be trapped in the cycle of poverty, informality. So this makes them, which makes them it's difficult for them to transition from the formal sector, from the informal sector to the formal sector. So addressing the disadvantages of the informal sector in a country typically involves implementing policies and initiatives aimed at formalizing informal activities. However, this process can come with certain costs and challenges in the short run, but may be beneficial in the long run. So this leads us to talk about now the opportunities of migration. So overall, the term burden implies that migrants, either individually or collectively, are perceived to have a negative impact on the economic well-being of the host country. However, it's essential to recognize that this perspective may not capture the full range of contributions that migrants can make to an economy, such as filling labor shortages, increasing the demand on the local markets, promoting entrepreneurship, and enriching cultural diversity, which can have positive economic implications in the long run. So the participation of migrants in the labor market can enhance the local economy in several ways, in certain contexts. So we said first, they can address the labor market, the labor shortages. In certain regions or in regions experiencing labor shortages, the refugees or migrants' participation in the labor market can help fill gaps in various sectors such as agriculture, construction, and services. And this can prevent disruptions in production, maintain economic activity, and support continued growth. The second opportunity is the diverse skill sets. So migrants often bring to the labor market diverse skill sets, including expertise in areas such as craftsmanship, entrepreneurship, skills that may be scarce among the local workforce, and employers can benefit from this diversity. The third opportunity is the fact that some migrants have entrepreneurial skills and they can be innovative. They may be seeking for opportunities to establish businesses and contribute to local economic development. The fourth opportunity is that increased refugee or migrants' participation in the labor market can lead to higher disposable income. And this income will lead them to have greater consumer spending, thereby stimulating demand for goods and services in the local economy. And this can benefit businesses and create additional employment opportunities, generate multiplier effects across various sectors. The fifth is that integrating refugees into the labor market can foster social cohesion and community resilience by promoting interactions and collaboration between refugees, migrants, and host population. So employment opportunities provide avenues for cultural exchange, mutual learning, shared experiences, and this will contribute to greater social integration and harmony. Of course, if the informal sector is formalized, then they will be their participation, the refugees and migrants, labor forced participation can generate additional tax revenue for local governments through income taxes, social security contributions, and consumption taxes. And these revenues can be reinvested in public services, infrastructure, education, health system, social welfare programs, and these all will be beneficial for both migrants and host communities. So overall, the participation of refugees in the labor market, or migrants or refugees in the labor market, can be a win-win scenario for both migrants and host communities, fostering economic growth, social cohesion, and sustainable development in certain contexts. However, realizing these benefits requires what? Requires supportive policies, requires investments, requires partnerships that facilitate refugee and migrants integration, entrepreneurship, and access to opportunities in the labor market. Towards the conclusion of my presentation, I will inquire about the contribution of social and solidarity economics in aiding migrants entrepreneurs in the host country and fostering their integration. So being locally rooted and close to the needs of both recipients and the local population, the social and solidarity economics entities strive to integrate migrants into the hosting labor market, while also fostering community engagement and supporting local and social economic development. Social and solidarity economics can play a crucial role in developing entrepreneurship among migrants in the host country by providing a supportive environment and access to different resources. They can provide the community support, they can provide access to finance, they can provide them some sort of capacity building, and they also can help them in the market or to access to market. Social and solidarity economics also can help in empowering and inclusion of those migrants. So overall, social and solidarity economics offer a holistic approach to supporting entrepreneurship among migrants, because it doesn't only address the financial needs, but also it addresses the social, cultural, and institutional barriers by promoting collaboration, solidarity, and community empowerment. These approaches can contribute to the economic integration and the well-being of migrant entrepreneurs in the host country. Thank you for your attention. I'm sorry for these inconveniences, the last minute inconveniences.
No, it's fine. Thank you very much, Dounia, for your presentation, which is very interesting. So I maybe ask you already one or two questions before handing over to Oroub. I was wondering, because we had this discussion already in our last roundtable together with Leila Simona Talani. She is studying international political economy on migration. And I asked her very honestly whether she believes that migration is indeed a boost and not a burden for host states. And she clearly said that it totally is, and that all countries and all governments agree on that, because more migrants obviously means more productivity for an economy, and there was also an increase in the GDP. So despite all those positive aspects that you also outlined, filling labor shortages, setting up new companies. And I also read an article, by the way, from Philippe Mustar, a professor at Mines Paris PSL, who also wrote not on immigration in the Arab world, but on immigration in the United States, that here as well, he took the example of the unicorn enterprises that are now mushrooming everywhere, and where he clearly says that even in the United States, immigrants made the economy to a certain extent. So I was wondering if we if we know all that, why is there not more inclusion of immigrants than in the economies of host states?
Why is there? Why I didn't understand the question. Why inclusion of migrants? Would you please repeat your question, Isabel?
Yeah, I said why if we know all the positive aspects that including migrants in your host economy has, why don't we see more inclusion then? And why is there still barriers, hurdles, legal obstacles that do not allow for more inclusion? I think that's the $1 million question, and Oroub will probably also answer to it in her presentation, but I'll just back to hear on that.
Okay, I think first that, in fact, as I said in my presentation at the beginning, it depends on the goals. First, the goals of the migrants. For instance, if I stick to the case of Tunisia, those who come to Tunisia from those who come from sub-Saharan countries, their main goal is to go to Europe, to migrate to Europe. So Tunisia is just a transit country for them. Okay, few migrants they stay, but we all know that these migrants they come with low skills and unskilled, and the government, for example, here in Tunisia, we need many programs, many initiatives in order to train these people, in order to have them to have the required skills in order to be productive. And I also talked about the fact that these migrants, they come and they're hired by the informal, they work in the informal sector. And the informal sector in these economies, and I'm talking again about Tunisia, it's a burden for the whole economy. So why, despite the fact that migrants, despite the fact that there are many advantages and there are also disadvantages, and here we need to weigh to conduct a cost-benefit analysis, and what that we call an economic cost-benefit analysis, to see whether we need to work on more initiatives and more programs in order to have those migrants in the formal sector and to contribute positively to the economics. So the question is more, I think it's more about resources, and it's because we need more resources, as I said, for initiatives and for trainings and even for laws, for the enforcement of the law.
Yeah, I think it's about resources, but it's also about how we frame the question, right? And how we look at the migrant as an invader or not. And I think Oroub will probably talk to that. So I'll hand over, and then we can come back to this point in the discussion maybe. Oroub, let me also please introduce you, very briefly to the audience. So Oroub El-Abed, she's an associate professor at the School of Graduate Studies, the Forced Migration Program at Birzeit University, Palestine. And until recently, Oroub was the lead researcher in Jordan and co-investigator at the Center for Lebanese Studies on several research projects studying several communities, both locals and refugees, with intersectional approaches in the Middle East. Oroub completed her PhD in political economy of development studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Her research work has been focused on refugees and vulnerable minorities in the Middle East. She has also taught several courses on development, livelihood, and forced migration issues, and has consulted for several UN and international NGOs and published articles in the area of development and forced migration in the Middle East. She has also published a book on Palestinians of Egypt and some other work on Palestinian refugees from Gaza living in Jordan. and her book that is coming out soon is studying the Palestinian originated Jordanians of East Amman. So maybe she will also let us hear a little bit about that. Thank you very much, Oroub, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and I very much appreciated listening to my two colleagues. The paper presented by Dounia definitely builds up well on what I'm going to present. So I was invited to talk to you about how Jordan benefits from hosting refugees, which is basically the field of specialty that I am focused on. So I won't be addressing migrants. I won't be talking about Egyptian workers. I will be rather talking about refugees, those who were forced to arrive to Jordan, and Jordan hosted them. What's happening? Voila. I'm gonna have my talk is divided into two parts. A part where I would like really to set the scene a bit for us to understand, and in a way to answer your question, Isabel, just for us to know the context of Jordan. Number one, how important it is for us to understand the kind of impact that refugees do on the country. We need to understand, to lay down the principles. Number one, as Jordan, that is not a signatory country of the 1951 Convention, therefore, it does not assume, does not believe that it can assume the responsibility vis-a-vis refugees. And to do that, to analyze this element, it's very important for us to understand the importance of Jordan as a rentier economy. And the rentierism, since you have already addressed the issue of rentierism, but the rentierism is a very important element in understanding how Jordan is giving rights, and based on what it is giving rights to those comers, influxing comers. It's important as well to look into the political agenda. What nationality are these refugees from? Are they Palestinians? Are they Iraqi? And why do I really need to serve them? Are they Syrians? And what is the relationship I have with Syrians? Are they Yemeni? And ainsi de suite, quoi. And this very much, this understanding of political agenda shapes also a very important element, which is the financial. As a rentier country, the political agenda is very much connected with the financial agenda. And these two create what is called labeling. I always make fun of the fact that Syrian refugees, when they arrived in Jordan in 2011, 2012, the newspapers used to say hotels are overpacked with tourists. So they were labeled as tourists. We all know that Iraqis, when they arrived in Jordan, to a very good point, in fact, for quite good years, I would say more than 5 years, they were labeled as guests, and they were not really labeled as refugees. Again, for that, falling into with the element that the country is not a signatory of the 1951 Convention, and therefore nothing obliges it to see these people as refugees. And then I'm gonna take you to an approach that was done by the state that very much took Jordan to what's called the Jordan Response Plan, or the response plan that was imposed on both Jordan and Lebanon, and how this very much was an asset or an added value to the economy, but also to the development of the state. So this is one aspect, but also the security element is a very important element to bear in mind. How the state is handling these refugees who are coming to its borders from a security perspective, bearing in mind that Jordan has always had open border politics. And this is it's a very important thing to think about, that the doors have always been opened. Iraqis in the 90s just came in, Syrians at the very beginning that just came in. We know Palestinians at the very beginning of 1948 also just came in. Certain incident, and that was the major incident that affected Jordan in 2005, when Iraqi troops, guerrillas, bombarded 3 hotels in the country, that Jordan took its attitude and started closing its doors, particularly towards Iraqis, where the doors usually were very open to Iraqi influxes. And I'm going to finish with just an understanding of the benefits, amalgamating it with the concept of the humanitarian aid versus the development aid, so that we can see the assets or the added value of receiving refugees from a wider perspective. And I'm going to do this talk. I'm going to divide, my second part is that I'm going to divide chronologically how Jordan has dealt with refugees in 3 parts. This is the way that I see it. I see that Jordan did integrate refugees for a certain period of time. Again, in response to your question, Isabel, for a particular time. And this time, I see it as the politics of integration and the politics of synchronization. It was an amazing period of time where the human capital synchronized with the financial capital in the region. And that was a perfect time for the development of the country and for the added value of this human capital to the economy in the state. Then I take you to a stage that I also labeled it the politics of survival and exclusion of the others, where I argue it is from 1980s onwards until the year 2000 when we started receiving Iraqis. Officially, the major wave of the Iraqis. And then the politics of resilience. This is the trendy word that now everyone is using. And what do we really mean by resilience, and how resilience is an added value or not an added value to the economy. I'm going to take you really quickly through the first part of my intervention, where it's important to take into consideration that Jordan, since its creation, has been a country very much dependent on 2 very important inputs to its GDP. Number 1, it's the aid. And with the word aid, it's very wide. It can be loans, it can be long loans, short loans, grants, but it's this aid that's coming from the international community. And the second part that was the synchronization for the economy of the country was the remittances that were brought in by the Jordanians who are living abroad. In fact, it started from the year 1955 when we started having the first lot of people who went to the Gulf countries, but until today, Jordan's input from the remittances today does exceed almost 6 billion on yearly basis. So rentierism is very important. Why? It's important on one hand because it makes us understand the dependency of the country on the external funds, whether it is a local fund or FDI or international. But also this rentierism does shape a very important mentality in the people, where people become dependent on the kind of aid that they are getting from their state. This happened, and this was engendered in the 80s, in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, when a good part of those Jordanians who opted not to leave to the Gulf were in Jordan and were given these opportunities. Come and work in the government, come and work in the public sector, and I will give you a credit so that you build a house. I will give you a credit so that you teach your son. So that very much shaped a very important rentierism mentality amongst people. So it is as if it is a dependency that generates further dependency. It's a vicious circle of dependencies. So this is one element. The second element that's important to look into it when we're thinking about Jordan and its relationship with refugees is the political agenda. Very particular relationship Jordan had with the Palestinian conflict. And because of this very particular relationship, Jordan had to, in the year 1949, to give the nationality to the biggest part of the Palestinians who arrived to its territories. So this is one element that's also important to consider. So Palestinians at the beginning were given the Jordanian nationality. As the second lot of the Palestinians who arrived later in the 67 were not given the Jordanian nationality because it was argued that this will very much amalgamate rights and it will take away the right of return from Palestinians. But most importantly, and we need to give it credit to the fact that at at that time, by 67, there was the threat that was put on Jordan to have, of course, by the Israeli Likud, that wanted to make Jordan as the alternative homeland. So because of this kind of threat, this political situation, Jordan took a stance against those people who arrived from Gaza and did not really give them the Jordanian nationality. This is very important just to understand how brain tourism on one aspect, political agenda, and the funding. And here we come to a third element, the funding of the international community. Once again, we're talking about a country that's very dependent on the international aid. But the funding, when it comes to the refugees, it's very important to situate it under the politics, the policy of containment that we have been talking about it, unfortunately, for the last, today, almost more than 20 years. We've started talking about it since the year 1999 loudly, and we have articles written about it. Of course, it existed before, but it became loud and visible since 1999, when the international community decided to continue its role, the burden sharing, the role in sharing the responsibility with countries that are affected by the conflicts of receiving refugees. Yet the reception was, or the kind of aid, pardon me, was not by opening the doors anymore, like the way it used to happen in the 90s, in the early 90s, with what happened to Iraqis, for example. Lots of Iraqis in the 90s did arrive in the West easily. By the year 2000, the international community shied away from this different culture, different color, different people, different religion. Remember, by the Islamophobia that was very much in the building. So the option was that we will give money to the region that is hosting the refugees, where we are obliging refugees to stay in their region. And this will be our contribution rather than them coming to us. And this was an opportunity also for Jordan to take advantage of, because it was hosting the refugees, and that poured the money into the Jordanian economy in order to contain the refugees who arrived to its borders. I believe I did tell you earlier about what do I mean by labeling. So both words, funding and politics, do shape the label. If I don't have money as a country, I cannot label you as a refugee. So if I have the money, I will label you as a refugee. So it is the kind of funding. That's why I'm saying, even with citizens, we know that we have Palestinians who are equal citizens, on a par of citizens on one hand, but we know that we have sometimes those very, very citizens of Jordan sometimes are labeled as refugees, because when labeling them as refugees, I can generate money for the refugee camps, which is the story of Jordan vis-a-vis UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. So people who are living in these camps are Jordanian citizens, but at the same time, they are refugees. So the hat shifts sometimes between seeing them as refugees or seeing them as citizens. Refugees when I want to emphasize their presence in refugee camps, citizens when I want to emphasize their paying of taxes, for example. Same applies to, as I mentioned earlier, to Iraqis who were at one point, they were labeled guests, and then later on, they fell under the umbrella of refugees when the MOU was signed, the Memorandum of Understanding was signed with UNHCR. Same applies to Syrians, same applies to Sudanese and Somali and Yemeni, and we'll talk about them in a minute. This very much falls, this kind of labeling, that takes us to the issue of visibility and non-visibility, as I mentioned earlier. So the Palestinians, when I want to see them as refugees, I focus on their presence in refugee camps. When I don't want to see them as refugees, I focus on their presence within the urban settings. And same applies also to the Syrians, particularly the Syrians, that because we do have the majority of the Syrians living within, I may say, have melted within the urban settings versus those who are very much seen within the camps up in the northeast of the country. So, and again, another element that we are to consider, often the country opts in this governance vis-a-vis refugees is to see them as one pattern. So I come out to the world and I say, the Palestinian refugees in Jordan, And this is a bit, it's a bit of a very particular kind of approach done by the official discourse. Same applies to the kind of Syrian refugees. When Jordan signed the Jordan Response Plan, it decided just to give the right to work for Syrians in 3 domains: in construction, agriculture, and services. Does that mean that the refugees have been labeled as the ignorant, not educated, limited people with limited abilities, therefore they can be just limited within this field? So what are we to do with the others? So and there was no response. Like voila, you have only these, so deal with these, which is a bit of a dodgy approach, where you are marginalizing the others. Meanwhile, in the Jordan Response Plan, the emphasis was very much on social cohesion and tolerance. How can this be done when you are very much emphasizing a one pattern, a one image of the refugee, which is the image of vulnerability, the image of ignorance, the image of non-education, etc. So this is quite, in my view, it's quite dangerous. But this is how the governance has been happening by the state, and it's important for us to keep this in mind when we are analyzing the chronology of time. I'm going to finish with this. I'm just highlighting this, but I'm saying how important also with this agenda of the state to take into consideration how the funding at one point during particularly the Iraqi, in fact, it wasn't with the Palestinians, it wasn't with the Syrians. With the Iraqi, there was major emphasis on the fact that money will be channeled for the emergency, because the state decided to see that the money will go for temporary, the temporality of the services. So they decided just to limit the kind of services to international organizations who are serving the refugees. With the Palestinian story and the Syrian story, it was a little bit differently plotted. From the very beginning, when hosting Palestinian refugees, the state very much shaped the money that was flowing into it, into the development, especially that the Palestinians, when they first arrived, it was a state in the making. Remember, Jordan got its independence in the year 1946. The Palestinians arrived to its borders in the year 1948. So it was very much a country and economy in the making. So they opted to channel the kind of aid money coming from international organizations into the development and into the economic development of the state. I'll talk more about this when we go into the chronology, but this is very important, how the agenda of money and how when the state focuses on the development agenda, it pours the money into its own interest rather than limiting the money only into an emergency humanitarian kind of service that does not really fall into the wider interest of the state. So that was very well thought of when the Syrians arrived to the borders of Jordan. I did mention the whole issue of security, particularly for a state that really has major importance in having the open border politics. I'm going to take you to the 3 phases I analyze. So the first phase, which I call it the phase of integration or the phase of synchronization, amazing synchronization, was that in 1948, let me take you to the numbers. In 1948, it was the catastrophe. It was, unfortunately, we have now another catastrophe that we're living today in Palestine. But it was the very beginning of the transfer that the Zionist movement started doing against Palestinians by pushing them and dispossessing them from their homeland. And Jordan, because it sits on the longest borders with Palestine, with historical Palestine, ended up receiving the biggest numbers of refugees. It has hosted 41% of those who registered with UNRWA, with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. Now, a big number of those people, of those 41%, ended up really staying within the West Bank, which fell under the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. So a good part of the Palestinians were living within the West Bank, and the other part were living in the East Bank. What's important about this particular date is that in 1948, in December 1948, King Abdullah I decided to merge the West Bank with the East Bank and make it one country. So a part of Palestine fell under Jordan. And so what he did, King Abdullah I, he expanded Jordan demographically and geographically and pledged to the Palestinians that these are the three main pillars of the relationship between Jordan and Palestinians. Was he promised that also all those Palestinians who have been naturalized as Jordanians he will safeguard as a kingdom, he will safeguard their right of return. So that is an important element. So all those Palestinians who were within Jordan, with this expanded part of Jordan, were very much of a big added value to the state as at the economic level, particularly that at that time, the budget of Jordan was dependent on two sources. Source number one was Britain, where almost 100% of the budget in Jordan was dependent on the UK. And the second part was on the UNRWA. So UNRWA, specifically enough, the budget of UNRWA since its creation in 1950 started dividing its budget into two parts. A part was pouring and being channeled directly into the economy of the state, in the economic development of the state, number one. And the second part of the budget was being channeled towards refugees, which fell under the word health, education, and hardship cases. So that's very important to find that at the very beginning, there was this role by the United Nations in order to empower the economic development of the state, in order to integrate those refugees, citizens who arrived into its land. So this is important for us to take into consideration. It happened, that was really, I call it a miracle, a country with little resources, a nascent country with very limited economic development grounds. It happened that the Gulf, in the very first country was Saudi Arabia, when in 1955, they discovered the oil. And it coincided that lots of those people who were being trained by UNRWA, particularly the vocational training centers of UNRWA, were very much falling in perfectly what the Gulf countries were in need of. They needed technical and vocational people, well equipped, which was the case of the graduates from UNRWA schools, who had this chance to join the market, the nascent market, the rich market, the wealth market of the Gulf, and to go to the Gulf. The important thing about that was it fed Jordan into two parts. Number one, there was this amazing kind of support aid money coming from the revenue of oil to help neighboring countries, and Jordan was one of them. So Jordan became dependent on a new source of money, which was the source of aid money coming from the Gulf because of oil, the revenue of oil. But secondly, good resources of money was flowing into the country, channeled into the economy of the country, that was coming from the remittances of those originally Palestinian, originally refugees who are Jordanians working in the Gulf countries. So here we come to another important synchronization that fed and very much blossomed the economy in Jordan because of these financial sources. And because of this, we used to call, in lots of books, Jordan is called the welfare state, where we were talking about a public sector that was open to recruit everyone. And as I was telling you, it shaped slowly the rentierism mentality. There was all those originally Palestinian people who were working in the Gulf, feeding in money to their families, and the Gulf countries feeding in money to the economic development of the state. So that was very much like a socialist state, that really the perfect welfare state. And that was also an opportunity to be also fair, an opportunity to shape the allegiance. In fact, at the political level, there was this allegiance of buying people to the sake of supporting the state, whether those who are in the army or those who are in the public sector, whether, the public sector, whether it is the civil or the military one, versus the private sector shaping up of the people who were based in the Gulf, and eventually in the 90s came in Jordan and dominated the private sector. So that was a very subtle building up of the private sector and of those who are very affiliated to the state and those who were not very affiliated to the state because they were abroad. And that is slowly shaped up inequalities. And I'll tell you in a minute how these inequalities shaped up. Now, just before we move on to the second phase, in 1967, the second war happened in Palestine, and the West Bank, which used to fall under Jordan, was taken by Zionist Israelis, and that fled into Jordan, a good number, almost 300 to 350,000 to the country. Now, those people arrived in Jordan with capital, human capital, with financial capital, and with their assets, with their personal financial capital, that was very much of an added value to the country. But also a good part of them, they did not, as Jordanians, they did not decide to remain in Jordan. They went off to the Gulf. So we continue here with a circle of the remittances that widened because more people went to the Gulf, or more people were sending money to the country and feeding in the economy of the country with money. As I mentioned earlier, in that particular year, 1967, not only the West Bank people arrived in Jordan, but the Gaza people. And Gaza, I should have kept a map in here. Gaza people were, it's a bit far from Jordan, so we have the whole historical Palestine in the middle. Yet the Israelis created a channel that managed to trickle down thousands of Palestinians from Gaza into Jordan, those who arrived in Jordan as holders of Egyptian travel documents, because Gaza at that time was under the Egyptian military rule. And therefore, they were holders of Egyptian travel documents. Egypt refused to receive them back, and their number did not exceed at that time 50,000. And Jordan decided not to give them the Jordanian nationality, as I mentioned earlier, because of political reasons and political pressure that was put on Jordan by the Zionist state of Israel. Voila. So we ended up until today, sadly, I'm really sad to say that, until today, we continue to have those who are holders of the Egyptian, of provisional documents, not anymore Egyptian travel document, but Jordan had to shift it into Jordanian travel document. With very shy interest in making use of them. It was only, just the irony, it was only 2 years ago, can you imagine, only 2 years ago, that Jordan decided to give the right to owning property to the Gaza refugees who live in Jordan. So other than that, their right to access education, their right to access employment is quite shy and very limited. Only recently, they were given the right to own houses, which means also, thinking about it financially, it's a good occasion to pour their money into property and to give them that access to own property. So it's a way to make use of their wealth, particularly those who manage to make their wealth by living in the Gulf countries. I'm going to take you to the second phase. And the second phase tells us about, the beginning of the difficulty. As we know, in the 90s, it was an economic issue all over the world, and a country with limited resources like Jordan, the challenge was even worse. Not only that, just to mention just a little brief, in 1989, Jordan had a major event that affected its currency. So a major depreciation of the currency happened in Jordan because of economic major capital flight from the Jordanian banks that made the Jordanian dinar lose its value. The Jordanian dinar at one point, that was in 1989, used to be $3.50. Can you imagine? Today, it's barely 70 piasters could make $1. So it fell so strongly that it affected the economy. So in the 90s, there was too many variables that affected the economy. Number one, this issue of the depreciation of the currency. Number two, it was the beginning of the Gulf War. And remember, Jordan, again, I remind you, Jordan is a rentier state, very much dependent on Gulf money. So in the year 1990-91, the money flowing from the aid flowing from Iraq, number one. and flowing from the Gulf countries all stopped. From Iraq, because Iraq was in war condition. From the Gulf countries punished Jordanian people, not Jordan. It punished the people, the popular emotional support that they had vis-a-vis Saddam Hussein and vis-a-vis the situation that was happening in Iraq. So because of that, that very much affected the flow of money coming from the Gulf countries, but also affected the flow of money coming from international community. Also, the international community who was supportive of the war against Iraq punished Jordan and Palestine because of their emotional stance, the populist stance. And as a result, there was this major issue, number one, of cut off aid. Number two, because of the stance that the Palestinians and Jordanians did with the Iraqi, with Saddam Hussein, who was, of course, buying their love by promising them that he will bombard Israel, ended up being kicked out from the Gulf countries. So all the remittances that Jordan was very much dependent on stopped. So all these people flooded into Jordan, big number of people who flooded into Jordan. And number three, here we go. Let me just take you to this. So here we go. So we're talking about 350,000 returnees. We call them returnees because they are Jordanians. Indeed, they were originally Palestinians, but at the end of the day, they are Jordanian nationals who came back to their own country, to their own home, with their funding, with their human capital, and with their money. What's important about that phase, we had two influxes. So the influx of the returnees, the nationals, with their human capital, and eventually with their financial capital. It was held a bit, but eventually it was released. And number two, we had Iraqis. And as we know, the Iraqi war with America and with the international community had multi phases. The first phase started in 91, then later on it was in 98, then it was later in 2003, and then 2006. But what's important about the 91 and the 98 ones is that it brought in people with high education and people with wealth. And that was an important phase just to think about. And how, so let me take you back here. So what was important about this phase is that the Jordanians who arrived from the Gulf countries brought in their financial money, their financial capital. And this financial capital played a major role in the investment. In fact, according to the analysis of unemployment, to our surprise, today the unemployment in Jordan reaches 50% of the youth. Believe it or not, the unemployment in Jordan used to be only 2% between the year 1992 until the year 1996. Amazing. So that tells us that this money that was brought in by the people who were in the Gulf brought in not only human capital, where suddenly Jordan started having restaurants and coffee shops everywhere because that was not part of the welfare state, started having buildings everywhere, started having companies, enterprises. So we had a complete new shift in the economy. And this new shift was very much invested by the money that was brought in by the nationals who arrived from the Gulf and invested their money into the country. Another part that very much played for the sake of the economy in Jordan, despite these very harsh economic incidents and crises that happened at that phase, was the money that was brought in by the Iraqi guests. At that time, still we were talking about guests. So the Iraqi guests brought in their money. I can say, between parentheses, we can say it was a capital flight or, a laundry of money. Regardless, they brought in their money, and this money was also channeled very well into the economy. And that was very much of an added value to the economy. In 1998, with the number of refugees increasing, and here we come to the second phase, because there are three groups of flight from Iraqis.
Oroub, I'm sorry, but you've got 5 more minutes to leave enough time.
I'm done. In fact, I have another 2 slides. I'm going to take the last slide and I'm done. What's important about that phase was the Iraqi phase is that we got into the mass influx of the normal people. The middle class people who started coming into the country, and the country at that time realized by 1998 that it's not benefiting from them. And because it's not benefiting from them, they decided to go into signing the MOU with the UNHCR, where by that ground, and that now started applying to all the comers to Jordan, whoever comes into the country, they fall under this MOU, where Jordan pledges not to send back refugees back to their countries, but it does not take the responsibility over these refugees. Rather, it gives the responsibility to UNHCR to deal with these refugees. I'm going to move to the Syrian part here. I'm finished with that. And here I am finishing really with what we are living today. More difficulty in the economy, with more limitation and stagnation in the economy, and with increase in prices that did not only affect Jordan, but it affected the whole country. Yet what was important, because of these economic conditions that Jordan was encountering, and most importantly, because of the increase in the number of people who are now Jordan is serving. It's not serving anymore 3 million. It is today in Jordan, we're talking about 10 million. Because of that, they had to reconsider their approach with the refugees in order for them to better channel the money and the kind of aid money being given under the policy of containment to refugees, to channel it into what serves the own economy of the country. And that was well put into what we call the Jordan Response Plan. So the Jordan Response Plan had a particular kind of approach where they decided that money, rather than putting it into health clinics in order to serve those Syrian refugees coming from the war, it will be put into health, the Ministry of Health. It will be put into the Ministry of Education. It will be put into the public sector of the country. And a social inclusion, as they claim, we will open the door to refugees to come into these services. Ironically enough, by doing that, they excluded, let me take you to this, they excluded all the other refugees, and the rights were given only to the Syrian refugees, who are today about 1,500,000, 1,300,000, according to the government of Jordan. So one funny part is that we already had the Yemenis coming into the countries in 2013. We already had Libyans coming into the country. We're talking about 22,000. We already have Somalis and Sudanese who exceed 15,000. And ironically enough, the right of the Jordan Response Plan got limited only to one group. And this limited group was only the Syrians. Why? Because money was earmarked only to Syrian refugees as part of the policy of containment. I'm going to close with these two things. I'm going to say the pros and cons of hosting refugees. The pros, of course, it increased the demand and it bolstered the demand. By the way, the GDP of agriculture today in Jordan used to be 1%. Today, it's 4%. So that tells us lots. More mouths are eating, but also more hands are working. We have more people working in that field. Of course, there was an increase in the foreign aid and its positive effect on development. It created jobs that we cannot deny. The number of INGOs that created branches to serve refugees all over the country generated jobs for all those Jordanians, not only refugees, to serve refugees. There was a clearly seen change in the culture of work. Jordanians never, in periphery areas, never worked as carpenters or as mechanicians. Today, you go and see a technical person, Jordanian, working, all because they were inspired by these Syrians who gave them the example of hard work. Same applies to the issue of entrepreneurship. More shops got created, again, because of this input that was brought in by the refugees. And I will leave the word competition to the questions. Let me take you to the cons. Jordan is a country with limited resources, and this is something that we cannot really deny. And it's a very highly dependent country on external aid, as I mentioned in my presentation. After the economic shocks, Iraqi arrived. This is something quite interesting. Iraqis arrived in Jordan, as I mentioned to you, in a very particular time that was very critical and chronicle in the economy of the state. Syrians, in the midst of their being in Jordan, encountered COVID. And you know that the COVID effect very much trickled back on all the countries, including a very limited country like Jordan with its limited resources. There has been a clear decrease, and I can say depletion, of the resources coming from the international countries towards refugees. And this is very much of an alarming matter. This has very much affected the small and the middle enterprises in the country, who felt very much threatened by the presence of the others. And lastly, this is a point that was already mentioned and clearly explained by Dounia, the issue that because of the no rights and no litigation, that exposed refugees to highly exploitative market, where they are working, they are bringing in their human capital, even their financial capital, yet they were exploited. And I'm finishing with that. I'm finishing with this image that very much tells us the reality. It is governance that very much engenders disparities, whether with refugees or with citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oroub, for this very thought-provoking presentation. If you don't mind, Oroub, I will first hand over to Maya, and then maybe if we have time, we take the questions. So Maya, I will present you as well very briefly to the audience, and then I will share also your PowerPoint. So Maya Chehade is an international development professional with a doctoral degree in political science from the University of Sciences Po in Paris. She brings a dynamic and multifaceted professional background to the table, characterized by her experience as a researcher and her track record working directly with the private sector and international donor organizations in sub-Saharan Africa and the MENA region. Through her PhD, Maya evaluated Syrian refugees' entrepreneurial trajectories in Egypt and Jordan between 2011 and 2023, with the goal to better inform existing policies and projects that use entrepreneurship as a tool for refugee integration in host countries. Maya, she will be talking to us about the Little Series of Cairo, a renegotiation of spaces through entrepreneurship. So I will share her PowerPoint and I hope it will work.
Yes, thank you very much, Isabel. And thanks everyone for, thank you, Dr. Oroub and Dr. Dounia and Dr. Paul, I think, who had to leave due to the time difference for this very, very insightful discussion. So today I hope that you hear me well. The internet connection in Cairo is not always very stable, but I will try to make my best and just let me know so I can cut my video if there's any problem with the connectivity. So today I suggest to actually look into what I call, or what my informants called, or still call in Cairo, the Little Series of Cairo, renegotiation of spaces through entrepreneurship. It is based on a fieldwork in Egypt and Cairo that lasted for 18 months, and that was based on ethnographic research, observation, and interviews, qualitative research mostly. And that is part of my dissertation, which was at Sciences Po, and which I actually was able to present and complete in last December. So the idea of what I will be presenting today is really questioning through the case study of Syrian refugees, the case of a reconfiguration of space in a host country, which actually taps into the question of I hope into today's session, which is the impact on host countries through a population that was very known for its entrepreneurial activity here in Egypt and in Cairo. And what I actually really question is how Syrian refugees, through their entrepreneurial trajectories or activities, were able to offer a new perspective on new spaces, which are considered the new cities of Cairo. So here first, I would like to maybe question and maybe put a bit of a background information on what entrepreneurship is, and maybe lay the ground of the discussion as a path for social and economic integration in Egypt. is it, and why is it so? It is considered as one of the main public policies in the host countries of this region, and it's worth questioning why. I actually argue that entrepreneurship offers opportunities that sometimes can be unequal and that are based on urban space and where these refugees are located in Cairo, at least in my study. And this is actually analyzed through different spaces, and I argue further that there is an appropriation of space that is possible in certain cases in Cairo, what I call actually the little Syria, such as the case of 6th of October, 6th October here in Cairo. And I also consider there's that it was possible for certain Syrians in certain urban spaces to reconfigure Cairo space through their businesses and entrepreneurial activities. And then I hope to offer a case study, a very, very small case study of a trajectory of one refugee here that transformed the space through the creation of a whole new value chain through the case of a food business. So, entrepreneurship as a path to socioeconomic integration in Egypt. Entrepreneurship is defined here as a creation of new organizations. And there is a debate on what is entrepreneurship. Is it considered as corporate activity, or can it be considered as a wider civil society activity? Is it a small or individual entrepreneurship? And can it be also considered from an anthropological perspective with regards to providing and studying the agency of a refugee? And here, just a side note on refugee, I consider all Syrians who have left and who were forcibly forced to leave Syria after 2011 as refugees in Egypt, regardless of their legal status, which is an important point to consider in this analysis. And entrepreneurship, as Dr. Oroub and Dr. Dounia explained it very well, is a form of resilience or self-sufficiency by a lot of actors, and that it has been extensively reviewed in the literature, and it can be considered as a pathway to self-sufficiency, as seen in the latest report of the World Bank in 2023, which actually considers entrepreneurship as a way to advancing their self-sufficiency, not only in developing host countries, such as in the MENA region, but even in developed countries. So, but from a micro perspective, from a trajectory perspective of the refugee, it's not only an economic activity, because as Schreiner and Waller rightfully describe, it's the umph that drives sacrifice and the presence with the hope of a better future. So I'm really interested here in the agency and what it offers from that perspective. And what I argue is that in the case of my study, at least, there are different categories of Syrian refugees actually supporting some of the existing studies on Syrian refugees in the region. And I consider that entrepreneurs should be not only defined by their economic activities, but also according to their previous socioeconomic backgrounds and from a class perspective. So if entrepreneurship can be considered as a path in host countries, providing an impact on the host country's economy, then I argue that it offers unequal opportunities for refugees according to urban space and to where these refugees are actually located and where their entrepreneurial activity is located. I here would like to give you two case studies of refugees' trajectories. The names have been anonymized, but just to maybe give a bit of an illustration of my case, Abu Samir, who lives in Khan Khalili, this is based on a true story, has mobilized his human and cultural capital gained as an artisan in Syria in order to produce a very rare technique of mother-of-pearl products to sell in Khan Khalili, which is the historic center of Cairo. He tried to provide for himself and his family by transforming his skills into economic returns but he really struggled to do so due to a highly competitive market and to a political economy dynamics in Khan Khalili that made it very difficult for him to integrate the market. On the other hand, Sami, in 6th of October, used his human and cultural capital to produce traditional products, very traditional perfumes that can exist in Syria, and was able to mobilize social networks in this neighborhoods to navigate in 6th of October and to be able to sell his products. I cannot see the screen anymore. No, that's great. No, it's fine. If we can go back to the previous slide, please, Isabel. Yeah, so the idea here is why was Sami able to successfully transform his skills into economic returns and actually participate to the transformation of the space he inhabited whilst Abu Samir wasn't? So I argue that in certain urban spaces, such as in 6th of October, if we could go to the next slide, they do so due to the inability to appropriate space through entrepreneurship. And this idea of appropriation of space of refugees already exists in the literature. Dalal actually studied this in the Zatari camp with a very illustrative case of urban planning and analysis. And I actually build my case on that argument by looking into the specific case of economic activity, but from a social and sociological sense. So the little Syrias which are known in here and by the local community in 6th of October are known so because of enclaves of Syrian that have concentrated in this neighborhood, which is and Syrian migration filled up these empty spaces in 6th of October, which were actually described as spacious new cities from failed public policies through their migration and forced migration, but also through their entrepreneurial activities. And as you can see on the map that I haven't produced and that Rasha Arous produced through her very informative study on 6th of October, shows how Syrians were concentrated in different spaces or in different neighborhoods of this new city, according to different waves of migration. So just to give you a bit of a background on 6th of October, it was developed in 1981 as one of the new urban community administrations situated 65 kilometers from Cairo's historic center. And it was part of this goal of decongestion of Cairo. It has been described, as noted before, as part of a failed, semi-failed public policy because the occupancy rate of the city in 2006 was only at 36%, with only 145 inhabitants. And in 2012, there were already 30,000 Syrians. And some informants that actually arrived to 6th of October described it as going from a desert city to a flourishing, blooming city that now they call the Little Syria. You can go to the next slide, please. So the reconfiguration of space took place through businesses, really, and a flourishing of businesses. This is a picture really of one of the neighborhoods of 6th of October that is very illustrative of how these businesses at least are organized from an urban perspective. And they actually, this urban perspective is also part of a social phenomenon that is called enclaves, the enclaves effect, whereby many members of a cultural group live and work in close proximity and providing for each other. So the social networking aspect is very important here, and it actually very actively participated to the transformation of the space as the concentration of these businesses make it seem as economic practices that of neighborhoods of shops that existed in Syria prior to 2011. So it's very interesting to look at these spaces as a reproduction of space, really, through a reappropriation of space that was possible through a transformation of an urban space that was actually considered as completely empty through entrepreneurial activity. And there's a sense of community between the businessmen and entrepreneurs working there, as they say that we tell each other when they come, authorities come in consideration with the informality and the informal activities that Dr. Dounia talked about earlier. If we can go to the next slide, please. So really here, I would like to illustrate my presentation with the case of, and to take it a bit further, by looking at the transformation of spaces. And here spaces, I look at the cultural, the social, and the economic space, not only the urban space, through the creation of a new value chain, really. And the case of Abu al-Khair, and basically Abu al-Khair, to give you his story, he is a refugee who arrived after 2011. He started off as a home-based business entrepreneur selling olives and labneh, to opening a whole franchise of supermarkets in Egypt, in different neighborhoods and upper middle class neighborhoods, creating a whole new value chain, or participating to the creation and transformation of Egypt's economy in the food sector, at least, through Syrian food and through a certain mobilization of cultural capital. I don't want to go too much into how I use the mobilization of different types of capital, but I support fully Dr. Paul's approach, Bourdieu's approach of looking into migration study, because I believe that it adds a lot to the analysis. But here, really, what we see is a transformation of a mobilization of cultural capital through food items into a whole new value chain, and new companies manufacturing Syrian food items and new types of food shops. So, and it all started organically, because before creating these manufacturing businesses, the same person started trading with outside of Egypt in order to import goods. And he saw the opportunity to actually start creating his own and manufacturing goods, and actually also creating business for his peers that are linked to the Syrian cultural capital, or if I may so. So if we look maybe just briefly at the picture, it's of course a supermarket, but it's not any supermarket. It's a supermarket that is not typical of the Carrefour or the big supermarkets that we know, because it's very typical to a model that exists in Egypt that is similar to the one that we know from the big distribution, but that is very particular to the Egyptian upper middle class supermarket model, where there is a bakery section, there is a food section that is linked to Egyptian food items. And here Abu al-Khair actually created his own model, where he added dedicated spaces to Syrian food items, such as Syrian sweets, labneh, olives, and food items that are linked to breakfast food, and also the nuts, the takhlita, all types of nuts that are also very typical of this cultural capital that has been mobilized and completely used to transform this space through this value chain. And I argue here that social networks, that it's not only economic in the sense that social networks and social capital has also been very important in the mobilization of capital in these spaces, since it's not only the economic activity that is important here, and not only the food items that are important here, since one of the interlocutors that was one of the managers of this food store, supermarket, explained that it was very important for Abu al-Khair to employ Syrian employees and in his supermarket to not only offer food items, but the whole food experience, sales experience in that. And here I quote, "You cannot ask an Egyptian to sell takhlita, assortments of nuts, or Levantine yogurt the same way a Syrian would do it. Sales with Syrians are part of a cultural know-how and culture of selling that is part of us." So I find it very illustrative and very fascinating to see really how this transformation of space also goes in hand with the social capital as well. And I would like to conclude here that urban space since 6th of October has offered opportunities for refugees through entrepreneurship that led not only to urban transformation, but also to social and economic transformation. And it offers really a very interesting perspective on urban studies, current urban studies that look at these new cities as failed projects. The migration lens and the refugee lens, at least, offers really interesting perspective on how refugees can be considered as an asset or as a transformative part of a social transformation project of the host country. And here there's really a very interesting point in looking at the strategic mobilization of capitals done by these interlocutors, which sometimes was based on social networks when possible in 6th of October, symbolic capital, which I consider positive reputation that has been made possible in Egypt in comparison to Jordan, for example, or cultural capital when we talk about Sami or Abu Samir in their different respective cases. Entrepreneurship means different things, as noted before. I hope that the presentation shows that it actually enables agency to appropriate space, urban, social, and cultural. And it shows that entrepreneurship is very diverse, and we cannot just talk about entrepreneurship as a project and a public policy without really delving into how it's linked to the existing socioeconomic inequalities that are carried before and during the migration trajectories of refugees. It's very important to look at the political economy and the space and context in which these refugees live and impact economies, or more than just economies here in that case. And I argue it is part of a reimagination of an identity in exile where return remains difficult. In Egypt, in these certain spaces, refugees were able to appropriate these spaces and to reproduce social and economic practices through their entrepreneurial activity that is part of a survival of Syria outside of Syria that has been made possible.
Thank you very much, Maya, for your presentation. We have almost achieved our time limit today, but anyhow, I would love to take a couple of minutes to have a discussion with you, and I also encourage those of you that follow us on Zoom, if you have any questions, you can ask them directly to the speakers. A couple of elements that popped up while listening to you, Maya, and also to you, Dounia, and Oroub. Maybe you could answer them, share the questions amongst you, three of you. The first one is really linked to the issue raised by Oroub, the notion of migrants and refugees, and to what extent there might be a competition over labor between those two categories. In fact, also what you were showing in your presentation, Maya, is that we're talking about refugees, right? And Oroub also was talking about the Syrian refugees, how they integrated the agricultural sector in Jordan. So I was wondering whether there is somehow a distinction, a difference that is being made. Is it easier for refugees to resettle and to integrate also the economy by creating their own enterprises and so on and so forth, than it is for migrants. So this is the first question I have. A second point that came to my mind while listening to you, Maya, because at some point you were saying that, well, entrepreneurship is considered oftentimes as something that allows refugees to enhance their self-sufficiency. When we regard entrepreneurship in that way, do we not somehow depoliticize the problem of the being a refugee then as well, and to what extent does it put to a certain way the burden also on the refugee rather than actually on state institutions, international donors, and so on and so forth? But maybe it's also something that Oroub can respond to. And a third question maybe concerning on the experience you made with regard to Syrian refugees in Egypt. From what you've presented, I got the impression that there might exist some kind of network entrepreneurship, if we may put it in this way, in the sense that Syrians employ Syrians, but it's not a Syrian refugee that really employs also Egyptian workers, even from lower classes. So I was wondering whether you have encountered maybe examples where this also is the case, or is it really just entrepreneurship amongst the community, Syrians here in that case? And maybe also Oroub, I don't know whether you have examples, or Dounia, whether you have examples from the Tunisian case here. So I'll leave that here for the moment, and I pass you over the mic again. So maybe Maya, if you want to start.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much for the very important question of clarification, especially with regards to the depoliticization of entrepreneurship as a public policy. I'd like to start with this, if that's okay. I think entrepreneurship is used politically as a strategy, and that's something that I didn't go into because we were limited by 20 minutes. But it's part of this geopolitical dynamics between the northern developing countries and the host countries, and this is why I consider, and I think it's very important to look at entrepreneurship from a geopolitical perspective, and refugees as well from a geopolitical perspective, because they are part of international relations dynamics. And as we have seen in Dr. Oroub's presentation, they have been part of a whole rentier economy in Jordan, and they have increasingly been the same case in Egypt as well. And I think this question of entrepreneurship being sold as a self-sufficiency policy or opportunity is actually just part of a geopolitical dynamic that pushes the burden on refugees and takes less the responsibility on states. And this is why I was very, very insisting on the point of looking at refugees' socioeconomic background prior to their migration and during their migration trajectory, because whilst it can, in some cases, such as 6th of October, offer opportunities, it doesn't always do so. And this is why my case study and my comparative analysis for my PhD research was with Jordan, where it was much more difficult to do so. So it's definitely part of a political dynamic where refugees have to be more self-reliant and are actually even pushed to stay in their region of origin by showcasing their ability to self-sustain in places where cultural proximity has its impact, actually. With regards to the competition, I think I'm just gonna leave the floor to Dr. Oroub. Just very quickly on Egypt, most of my informants were collaborating with Egyptians when it was with regards to their businesses, whether it's home-based businesses or whether they're shawarma owners or whether they're even Egyptian stores such as Abu Khair. They are collaborating, but as I said, there is a strategic mobilization of capital. So there is a consciousness of what and how can Syrian cultural capital be mobilized strategically in their trajectories because of the appreciation and the consciousness of their reputation in Egypt and their symbolic capital mainly. And this is where it's very interesting to look at this specific point in different contexts. In Egypt, it worked. In Jordan, it didn't. In Egypt, they work together. In Jordan, well, there are more animosities in terms of I mean, in the cases that I looked at in Jordan, at least, I saw less Jordanian and Egyptians working in the collaboration than in Egypt, at least. That's just an observation. And then I mean, I did a qualitative study, so my sample cannot be representative, and it's just a specific case study that tells you about other wider things, but cannot be generalized. So that's just a methodological point that I would like to make. I'll leave the floor to Dr. Oroub or Dr. Dounia in order to complete, because there's plenty to say about this.
Oroub, do you want to go ahead, or Dounia?
I'm muted. I'm not muted. Okay, no. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Oh, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation about entrepreneurship, and I appreciate it highly. In fact, I'm just launching the results of a research studying labor marginalization amongst refugees and citizens in 4 governorates in Jordan. So we did address very much this issue. I'm gonna start just to respond to build on your last point, Maya. I believe we can start with the issue of legality. The legal ground, I mean, answers lots of our questions. In Jordan, for example, as per the Jordan Response Plan, there was a limitation for how many people will be given work permits. And the work permits were, on number 1, limited to certain sectors. The sector of agriculture, the sector of services, and the sector of construction. Voilà. And then they created another limit in order to widen the involvement of the Syrians, which was the flexible work permit, to involve more people into it. Lovely. So that was one element. But what we've seen, and that was clearly like as the work that was presented by Maya, Syrians are so good in service. They are service-oriented, these people. They are good in marketing. They're good in being self-employed. So what has been done in Jordan, self-employment, for them to create their own shops has not been possible. Why? Because Jordan put a conditionality. You can create your own shop, shop, dukkane, only if you have an investment of 10,000 JDs. And we know that these Syrians do not have the 10,000 GDs. So what happened, we ended up having, and this was, by the way, applied on all refugees, including, I'll give you the example of Yemenis. Impressively, Yemenis have all these shops and have all these restaurants of Yemeni food where the facade, the legality is done by a Jordanian, but who is working inside is a refugee. Now, this very much gives a very subtle power to the Jordanian, on one hand, and sometimes in this dynamics between who is in the front and who is doing the real work, very much gives this kind of exploitative kind of relationship, or a patriarchal relationship, although the real person who is making the shop work is the Syrian or is the Yemeni, is not the Jordanian. So the Jordanian is the one who does all the legality, and the Syrian is in the back, is hidden, is not visible. And this very much builds on the question on who recruits what? Like, do I recruit as a Jordanian? Do I recruit Jordanians? Syrians do recruit only Syrians? Again, as per legality, unfortunately, the Jordan Compact limited the right for Syrian refugees at 3 levels. At the beginning, it was they created certain jobs with what we call closed jobs. So they closed certain jobs for Syrians. That was 2016. In 2019, strangely, rather than opening more the doors, but it was the beginning of the economic situation, and soon we had COVID. The decision was, we do not want to see any more Syrians as technicians. So we used to go, for example, into shawarma place, and the chef would be in principle Jordanian, but we know it's not the Jordanian. The real chef is in the back, and all the guys around him are Syrians. They realized that this is very much opening jobs for Syrians, so they decided in 2019 not to permit Syrians to be technicians or the helper. So they took away more Syrians from the market, pushing them to be in the market as illegal and pushing them to be more exploited because of this illegality, where they were obliged to continue their work, but they were working in very illegal conditions. So does the network matter? It does matter, but it does matter when you are permitting Syrians to be more and more exploited, pardon me. And the good example, I'm afraid to say, since you were asking, Isabel, about agriculture, we all know, and this is a story that's so known in Lebanon, we all know that in the agricultural field, there is something called the landowner, number one. Then there's something called the mediator, which usually is the Egyptian person. And here we come to the third level. It's a hierarchy, whether we like it or not, and it exists. It's very well established in both Jordan and Lebanon in the very same shape. The third hierarchy is the shawish. The shawish is the Syrian mediator, I cannot call him mediator, he's the agent who brings in his people to come and work in the farm. And this shawish, as we know, stories from Lebanon and stories from Jordan, he exploits his people, he could abuse his people, he could not give them their rights, and he takes his share and their share. So it's a little bit of an irony, where there is the network, and there is often, when we were talking to shawish, we are seeing the shawish bringing in people from Hummus, for example, Rif Hummus or Rif Hamar, so they do come from one area. But yet that never means because you're my relative, you will be mindful of my rights. So we could trace that even the network, you can trace kind of exploitation. I believe and I'm going to finish with the first question that you raised. I'm sorry to say, it is, again, applies on both Jordan and Lebanon. The official discourse often emphasizes that the refugee influx is a burden on us as economy, but also is a burden on our people, on our citizens, because these refugees will compete with them. According to too many studies, FAFO has done an amazing study on the marketplace, and it showed that the percentage of competition between Jordanians and Syrians is only on 2% of the jobs. Meanwhile, Syrians in reality are competing with Egyptian migrant workers. And this is proved by the state itself, that because of the Syrian influx, it tripled the price of the residency for Egyptians in order to reduce less and less Egyptians from being in the state, so that wider space will be given to the refugees. So is there really this competition and the illusion that's given by the state that the problem in the economy is caused by the refugees? In my view, it's a negative, very pejorative official discourse that's being put on the table that is on reality not true. Thank you again for the provocative questions. Dounia, sorry for being long.
Dounia, are you with us? Do you want to react?
Yeah. Just I want to provide you, just if my internet connection allows me, just to provide, in fact, 2 examples of entrepreneurships in Tunisia. Here it's in the artistic field and in the beauty field when locals demand more and more of these services.
Thank you very much. Dounia, are you still with us or did it cut off?
Yes, I'm still with you.
Okay. Did you finish? Did you finish the?
Yeah,
okay. All right.
That these two examples of entrepreneurships in Tunisia. So
okay. Thank you very much for this. I would have to give you also the time to answer to the question that comes from Radhika Kanchana that is with us, and she has a question for Oroub and also a question for Maya, so I'll just read it to Oroub. She said, Oroub, you raised the point about the competition with locals or citizen labor. If you could potentially come back to that, and a question also to Maya, where she said, what is the nature of Syrian refugees integration? Could you tell us a little more about Egypt's policy for integration and what role it plays in the entrepreneurial success of using socio-cultural capital? So maybe
I believe I did answer the question, but again, just to clarify, which talks also to the question that you're raising to Maya. In general, with the Jordan response plan, there was this kind of focus on giving the ground to the Syrian refugees, particularly to be in the sectors I mentioned. In agriculture, for example, very, very, very few Jordanians are interested in working in agriculture, very few. So in reality, the competition is between Egyptians and Syrians. Same applies to construction. The real competition is between Syrians, Egyptians, and Palestinian refugees coming from refugee camps, where there is usually those people who could not pursue their education ended up in the construction. So this is the kind of competition that we can see. And again, because of the way the Jordan response plan has been designed, and as I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk, there is this one pattern refugee that the state decided that refugees are vulnerable and not educated. So they decided to completely take away from the scene the educated ones. You cannot be a dentist, or you cannot be a lawyer, or you cannot be really an advocate. You can be nothing. So those people were completely taken away from the scene. And many of them, by the way, added to good investors, had to seek their opportunities in Turkey or in Emirates outside Jordan, because Jordan did not really permit them to exist or to prove themselves in the market. So this is what I can say about competition. So it's really non-existent. Please go ahead, Maya.
Yes, thank you. So I believe the question is really linked to the legal framework, I think, of Syrian refugees in Egypt. And basically, in Egypt, Syrian refugees, whilst I consider them any first migration after 2011 as refugee, it's useful to note that many refugees or many Syrians that arrived after 2011 are not registered at the UNHCR, which is one of the particularity actually of the Egyptian case in comparison to Jordan, where there's less this opportunity. So refugees here are navigating between different legal statuses, whether of migrant status based on the education residency. So once one has their kids or is enrolled in education or higher education, they have automatically access to an education residency, which is actually very convenient to lots of them. And then there is the UNHCR status that gives actually the residency of only 6 months. So interestingly enough, lots of Syrian refugees opted out of the UNHCR or the refugee status, showcasing actually the fragility of this status, even with Egypt being a signatory of the Geneva Convention. So it's a very interesting case here. And there's the investor status, of course, which requires a $35,000 investment, which is actually common to any other non-migrant investor status. So, but really that's in theory, right? So in practice, what happens, and what I argue, is the semi-formality of the economy that allows Syrians to integrate, really. And it's not informality, because Syrians are able to navigate between the formality and informality by really pinpointing the aspects of the political economy that allow them to navigate legally while being kind of protected, while not fully being formally protected, which is actually one of the particularity of the Egyptian informal market. Well, I mean, if you're interested in the summer formality, Amr Adli outlines a very interesting study on how the informal market is or semi-formal is. So I really recommend his work on that. And then there's also really the political economy of the country. So it's sector-based. Syrian refugees are not successful in any sector, right? Because there are sectors where they are able to integrate and where they are accepted in certain urban spaces, as we saw. Being a mother of pearl artisan in Khan al-Khalili didn't work for this person, so it didn't work. But in 6th of October, it worked. So there's a political economy on a micro level, but also on a macro level. So, for example, even on an investor level, there are various businessmen that try to relocate from Syria to Egypt unsuccessfully in the pharmaceutical market, because it's a political economy sector that is inhabited and that is populated by the army here, and that is a no-go. So this is something to consider, really. The textile market, it depends. So really it's a case by case, and this is where I really think argue in line with some of the existing literature, where the migration policy towards refugees and migrants in general in Egypt is very ambivalent. So we don't know what it is. It's very interesting, and it's moving because it's in line with the geopolitical dynamics that are very moving, and where refugees, unfortunately, are at the forefront of a lot of discussions in the foreign policy, and also at stake in the local political economy dynamics of the country. So I hope that actually answers some of the question.
Thank you very much. If there are any other questions, then I would maybe like to say the closing words for today's session. Thank you, first of all, for having been with us once again, Maya, Oroub, Dounia, and also thank you to Paul, who left us already. If there is something to take away from our discussion today, it is probably that the contribution of migration to host countries' economy is definitely a positive aspect to register, especially in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of the diverse skills that those migrants also bring to the host states, in terms of the social cohesion that can be put in place, as has mentioned Dounia. But that all this, of course, is also linked to the way in which we label it. And this is something that Oroub has talked a lot about. How can we overcome also stigmatizing certain policies that are being put in place? How is the political engineering, also the legal constraints, channeling basically this process of integration of migrants into host countries' economy? So all this leads me to probably conclude that we need to reimagine also what a migrant is, maybe reconsider also this label as one of our speakers in the first session of this migration cycle has suggested, to really come back also to the human nature of the migrant, first of all, and admit that a migrant is a human being that has its political, cultural, and economic capital, and that therefore he or she can, of course, be not a burden, but also a benefit to host countries. Thank you for these wonderful discussions we had today. I also seize the occasion to announce the next roundtable of our migration cycle, which will take place on March 14. And Maya, your case today allows me really to also build the kind of transition with the topic of our next conference, which will be on migration and the urban space. So we have talked a lot about the reappropriation also of this urban space by the Syrian community in the neighborhood of 6th of October. This is definitely something that we will going to discuss in more detail in the next session as well. So it will be great to have you with us once again. Thank you to all of you, and I wish you a very pleasant evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye.